Today is the 23rd of August, 2016. And as long as I said that, I would like to say something about the 23rd of August, 1939. That was the day of one of the most decisive treaties of all time. It was the day of the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact and the decision of Stalin to stay out of World War II and allow the British and the French to declare war for the sake of Poland against Hitler alone, and left the Soviet Union neutral for about 2 years. And then this, in other words, when the 23rd of August treaty came out, everybody in the world knew that World War II was going to happen in Poland in a couple of days. And a week it did. So that is a historic date, the 23rd of August, 1939, and it just happens to fall on today, on the 2016. Anyway, the title of this is Hillary versus Trump at the Philadelphia Democratic Convention. And this is the second part of a lengthy discussion with Dave DeWitt, reporter for the and editorialist for the Athens News. And I am Robert Whaley, retired historian at Ohio University. And this is Athens Speakout on the 3/28. Now, by way of introduction, the last time we had a discussion of a right-wing Christian reporter by the name of Cal Thomas, who gave Trump an opportunity to speak for himself in a Chicago Tribune column or a Chicago Tribune radio subset that you could print this. And the importance of this article was that it's one of the few sources where we get Trump's words verbatim in print. Because Donald Trump is a real estate salesman, and he speaks off the cuff as an oral salesman. And the New York Times has never really interviewed Trump because Trump doesn't want to talk to the New York Times. So that's why Cal Thomas had this kind of unique article. So most voters are confused between political propaganda, religious propaganda, and ideological propaganda. And this election is probably one of the worst elections in the history of the United States. It has not yet reached the Buchanan 1856 president, when Buchanan was a Democrat from Pennsylvania who sided with the South, and that led to the Dred Scott case and the Republican Party and the Civil War. So Buchanan now holds the record of being the worst president in the history of the United States, but who knows what this election will bring. Anyway, most presidents of the United States have been either Episcopalians or Methodists, and John F. Kennedy was the first liberal Catholic to get elected as president. Now, Trump claims he's a Presbyterian. If he is, he's a very weak Presbyterian. And FDR was a liberal Episcopalian, and the 1920s was a period of Republican weakness. Harding was a card player and had two mistresses, and whatever religion he had, he didn't take it very seriously.
He also had a love child who grew up in Athens.
Yeah, I didn't know he...
A little bit of trivia there.
I didn't know he grew up
on Franklin Avenue.
Is that right?
Yes.
Is she still in Athens, or a family?
No, I don't believe so. I think the house is like a rental now, but we did a story about it last year.
Well, that's interesting. Well, anyway, Calvin Coolidge was the last real believing Calvinist, born in Vermont, and he became a rather weak president. But he was a true believer in Calvinism, which is the importance of Cal Thomas, because Calvinism is a weakening religion, weakened badly by World War I, further weakened by World War II, and there are very few Calvinists, that is, true believing Calvinists, in John Calvin's sense of Scripture, but lots of Calvinistic denominations who've been liberalized over the years. Now, Herbert Hoover was a Quaker, the first Quaker ever elected in 1931, and Herbert Hoover was a liberal Republican, but he would be very liberal compared to Ronald Reagan's brand of conservatism. But Ronald Reagan, believe it or not, had a religious Calvinistic background, unknown, but he belonged to a Calvinistic church known as the Disciples of Christ. And this became decisive during the nuclear disarmament negotiations when Ronald Reagan suddenly signed with Gorbachev nuclear disarmament treaties. Amazing. Anyway, anti-communism became the Manichaean religious ideology of most presidents from Truman right up to 1991, when the Cold War ended, the arms race ended, and the Republican Party seems to be lost for a new cause. So in summary, I always conclude with the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion, that means collection of taxes to support a religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech, press, right of the people, peaceably to assemble, and so forth and so on. So we do have a serious debate about the interpretation of the Constitution to this day. And the Republican Party is divided between all kinds of conservatives who have different factions of the definition of conservative. And that's why we went into Calvin Thomas's peculiar endorsement of Trump. He didn't endorse Trump. He just said Trump has raised an interesting question. Is he a true Christian or not? Question never answered.
I wanted to note that, and I think you know it, Robert, that Cal Thomas was educated at the American University
That's
in
true.
Washington, D.C.,
And
is
is
a
a
research hospital affiliated with the Methodist Church.
with the Methodist Church.
Yes.
But his name was John Calvin Thomas.
Right.
And John Calvin, the original Calvin, wrote a book of theology that has been very decisive in the Protestant denominations.
Well, it's no doubt his parents or grandparents or
Were
somebody
true
was
believers.
very, to name him John Calvin.
Right. So we'll call Cal Thomas an embarrassed Calvinist. So we're going now to a new question. Do you think that Donald Trump is a fascist? And we already started that. And we agreed that fascism might be a little strong, but I think we both believe, both Dave DeWitt and I believe, that he shows certain fascist tendencies. And that's not unique. We had Father Coughlin, we had Theodore Bilbo from Mississippi, we had Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, we had General Douglas MacArthur, who showed certain fascist tendencies. And it seems that fascism is being discussed again in connection with Donald Trump. So it is necessary as a historian, for me, and it's a duty, to be objective and define the difference between a liberal, a progressive, a conservative, a democratic socialist, a Christian socialist, a conservative, a fascist, and looking at this from a religious point of view, the Roman Catholic religion, the Eastern Orthodox religion, and 8 major Protestant denominations, all influenced by Calvinism, all define Christianity a little bit differently, and they're all nominally anti-fascist. So anyway, as a professor of history, I was always interested in Jewish students because I was raised in New York, and Pope Pius XII has a bad reputation in collaborating with Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini in the Second World War. So that is the religious ideological background to the present crisis within the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party seems to be uniting for the first time in many years, and coming out of the Philadelphia Convention united, while the Republican Party came out of the Cleveland Convention disunited. And the relationship between Jews and Christians is part of this problem. In 1945 to 1989, the Jews spent a great deal of attention to teaching Americans to drop any tendencies of being an anti-Semitic. The problem since 1967 is that we have Zionist Jews, Moscow Jews, American liberal Jews, conservative Jews, democratic Jews, and where we draw the lines of tolerance are a little bit unclear. But to get to the definition of fascism, its first characteristic is a dictator. Hitler called himself Der Führer. Mussolini called himself El Duce. It means the leader. A lot of American presidents are talking about they have leadership. They ought to look at that a little bit carefully. Leadership of what? Who are they leading? And where are they going? That's a very suspicious question. Now, in American history, we have a constitution which defines one president, 100 senators, 50 governors, and 435 members of the House of Representatives. So we have a decentralized form of
and
power.
the 9 members of the U.S. Supreme Court.
I was going to get around it. 9 members of the Supreme Court who interpret the law, and the Congress writes the law, and the president enforces the law. And then we have 50 governors who write state legislative laws and enforce local laws. And that is another big problem, that the United States is a federal constitution, and the Supreme Court is confused about states' rights and federal rights. And some people think the Supreme Court is overreaching.
Well, that's the age-old argument of American history, isn't
Right.
it? But I think that nullification was settled with a little war,
the Civil War.
mid-19th century, yeah.
The Civil War.
And yet those arguments are still pushed.
Yeah, and
have
when Martin
been
Luther
since.
King was established, the progressives, the liberals, all assumed that the United States was on the way of eventually eliminating racism. But then we had a backlash. The Southern strategy.
Well, yeah,
Nixon,
Nixon's
the
Southern
Reagans.
strategy, hoovering up the racist vote in the South from the Dixiecrats.
And that's part of this election.
Well, I think it would be fun. And remember, Supreme Court Justice John Roberts declared the day of Jubilee by gutting the Voting Rights Act. Apparently,
Well, he's certainly a
racism
conservative.
was over
He's certainly a conservative, maybe a reactionary.
when.
Corporate power over individual power.
Well, that ties back to fascism.
Right.
What the definition of fascism is.
Right.
And I think fascism is essentially defined by authoritarian
That's one of the
impulses,
principles.
but also, especially under El Duce, Mussolini,
Right.
the corporate power.
That's
So there's
another
3
one.
types of power. You have people power,
Right.
governmental power,
Right.
and corporate power.
Right.
Fascism emphasizes the corporate power,
Right.
lifts it up above the others.
Well,
That's one way to define it. There's a lot of theory and a lot of argument.
I agree with those 3 phases of it, but I think that there are seven aspects to the problem. The first one is easy. militaristic values, militarism over law. And that's really the second one. The first one was a leader, one leader, the duchy over all of us. One leader, militaristic values over law. And then the third problem is imperialism. Imperialism. The taking of land, labor, capital, and the culture of another people. And of course, Mussolini's object of imperialism was the whole Mediterranean basin. And he was going to restore the Roman Empire. That's what the Duchy was helping for. Mm-hmm. Well, he never made it. But that was his great ambition. Now, Adolf Hitler was going to invade the Soviet Union, destroy communism, and set up a new empire, a Reich that would last 1,000 years. Well, he failed in that ambition. But certainly, Hitler and Mussolini had a clear imperialistic foreign policy. That's easy, in a way. So we can come now to a fourth characteristic of fascism, which is a chauvinistic nationalism. That differs from liberal nationalism. The Americans, the British, are liberal nationalists. That is, nationalism is restricted by international law. So where does nationalism become imperialism? Unconsciously. So the Constitution allows for liberalism. The purpose of the Constitution was liberty and equality for all American citizens. And there was nothing in there to suggest imperialism. In fact, the enemy was the British Empire. So the United States starts out as an anti-imperialist republic. Well,
during the Revolution.
During the Revolution.
Okay.
But we have certain imperialistic tendencies.
Oh, yes. Well,
and that's the problem.
I would argue that essentially, eventually, we inherited the British Empire. And
some of it.
That's what gave us the American Empire of the latter 20th century.
Yeah, well, before we get to the 20th century, Mr. Madison made a mistake in declaring the War of 1812.
Yes.
He had a very idealistic reason. It was to stop impressment of seamen. But after he declared war, in 3 months, he came to the conclusion he made a mistake. Because there was a hidden factor in causing this war. The state militias in Vermont, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, who were going to conquer Canada and set up a 14th colony, Ontario, and that would be the end of the Canadian Empire and the British Empire in North America, and the American.
Well, there was still hope at that time
that was
to
their
have
hope.
A united continent.
Yeah, that was
there
their
were a lot of people
that was
who
their
still
ambition.
wanted Mexico too.
But the British fleet still could protect the British Empire. And the British fleet came down to Washington, burned the Capitol down, went down to Baltimore and put a siege around it. And Mr. Madison had to flee from the Capitol.
Right, Dolly had to save the portrait of
right.
George Washington.
Right. So anyway, Madison was a clever diplomat. And he said, well, we have to negotiate with the British. So he appoints a Federalist, John Quincy Adams, and he has 5 delegations, a 5-man delegation. 4 Democrats and John Quincy Adams go to Ghent in Belgium to negotiate with the British Empire, who was busy fighting Russia in 1812. That's why the Americans attacked. They thought they could get away with this. But the British had enough sea power to fight 2 wars, the land war in Russia and the sea war in the weak colonies. And Madison and Monroe got the United States out of a bad deal by signing the Treaty of Ghent, which demilitarized the Great Lakes and said, all right, we're going to make a border right down the middle of Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Huron, or up to Superior. When it gets to Superior, we have the 49th parallel, and it goes all the way, disarmed, to the Pacific coast. And Canada and the United States have been at peace ever since. That's one of the most lasting peace deals in the history of diplomacy. And John Quincy Adams issued the famous Monroe Doctrine, which was the fifth president. Monroe appointed Madison his Secretary of State, cross party lines, and John Quincy Adams wrote the Declaration, the Monroe Doctrine.
Right.
And it was directed against the Habsburg Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, all European empires.
It was declaring independence of the.
It was declaring independence of the United States, but it was asserting a certain sphere of influence.
Right.
It wasn't directly imperialist, but the Latin Americans thinks it's imperialist. They don't like the Monroe Doctrine. But the Monroe Doctrine says...
Can you blame them?
Well, they had trouble in Mexico, they had trouble in Cuba, we've had all kinds of trouble. But anyway, the Monroe Doctrine says that the Western Hemisphere is preserved for the United States and the new Latin American republics, and any intervention on the part of Europe would be resisted by the young republic. Big declaration. But it was the British fleet that really enforced the Monroe Doctrine.
Well, almost all of British power during the course of its empire was based around its naval power.
Right. So there was a secret entente then. And anyway, we're kind of getting off fascism. And so anyway, the American presidents, some of them, have had imperialistic tendencies. The first was Madison. The second was a bad guy by the name of Polk.
Mexican-American War.
He attacked Mexico in order to get more land, in order to get territory that would be valuable for settling of Anglos and...
He succeeded in
winning,
capturing a great deal of Mexico.
Right. And as long as they were in the military, they went right across Arizona and New Mexico, and they went to California.
Right.
And we had the Lone Star State, and we had the Great Bear State. Two independent republics which eventually joined the United States. Well, that's kind of indirect imperialism, kind of closet imperialism. Very, very clever. So America has some imperialistic tendencies, but not open as fascist imperialism.
No,
it's
if you want to draw the distinction.
Right. And that's how we get into the 20th
I think
century.
our 19th century exploits were a little bit more overt than our 20th century exploits or our 20th
Well, Teddy Roosevelt continues
exploits.
that. And he uses the Monroe Doctrine.
Oh, you mean the Splendid Little War?
Yeah.
In the Philippines?
Yeah, right.
John Hayes' Splendid Little War?
Right.
Yeah.
So we've had some imperialist presidents.
I think 200,000 Filipinos who were killed during that conflict.
That's right.
Argue that it was an overt
So this is an
imperialist
embarrassment
action.
on the part of the American Republican Party now. And the Democrats have become more and more anti-fascist as a result of Richard Nixon and the two Bushes.
and Reagan.
And Reagan. And a lot of them are saying, well, we've had enough in the Middle East. We can't have another Middle East war.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, I would like to see anybody. You know what I would like to see during the. I was watching the Republican debates this spring, and every time that they brought up some of Bernie Sanders' platforms, for instance, well, how will we pay for this? Or they'd ask the moderators asked Bernie Sanders, how are we ever going to pay for any of this? Just once, I would like to see them ask somebody how, when Ted Cruz said that he wants to set the desert on fire and bomb the Middle East into oblivion, how are we going to pay for that? Just once I would like to hear a news anchor ask them how they plan to pay for this.
Yeah.
We'll be paying for the
You're
Iraq
saying
and
the,
Afghanistan
you're saying
wars.
the Yankees are biased against Bernie
generations.
Sanders.
Well, I'm saying that they're biased in favor of war. They never
That's
ask
right.
how we're going to pay for war.
That's
they
right.
ask how we're going to pay for education and
That's right.
health care.
That's right.
They never ask how we're going to pay for endless military adventurism. I'd just like to hear them just once, ask
Right.
that question.
And that was defined by General Dwight Eisenhower when he retired. The military-industrial complex, instead of spending this money on atomic bombs, with the same amount of money, you could build thousands of schools, thousands of hospitals.
Absolutely. But no, that's socialism, so we can't do that.
Well, Dwight Eisenhower, when he went in the Army, had socialized medicine. That's another secret thing. The Army GIs got a socialist program the day they went in the Army. I could buy socialist insurance when I went in the Army. They said, you can have a lifetime policy. Do you want to take this policy or do you want to take it out? Well, I was stupid. I took it out.
Yeah. Well,
And the congressman,
I don't blame you. I
the
think.
Congress get a better pension than Social Security.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
what the state is saying.
And they get more paid time off than
Yeah.
anybody else in the United States.
That's capitalism. The rich get richer and the poor take what's left.
Capitalism.
Take the crumbs. Anyway.
Socialism for the
Anyway,
rich
to get
and
back to fascism, the fourth characteristic then of chauvinistic
capitalism for the
nationalism,
rest.
characteristic of Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, is that there are ethnic minorities in the state which they inherited from medieval times. There was a Polish minority. Hitler was going to conquer the Poles and make the Poles second-class citizens. The Italians had problems unifying. Mussolini came to northern Italy from Romagna. The Lombards, the northern Italians, looked down upon the Sicilians and the Neapolitans as inferior, dark, kind of unqualified Italians. So Italy has a difficulty in becoming a true national state. Germany had difficulties with French minorities, Polish minorities, Jewish minorities, and Hitler came from Austria, a multinational empire. Vienna was the capital of a multinational empire with 12 nationalities. And that's what drove Hitler bonkers and said, I'm going to be a pure German racist nationalist. And I'm going to move to Munich and I'm going to join the German army.
That seems like I don't know. It seems silly, and not just for the obvious reasons of the.
Well, you're an American sitting over here, qualified.
The racist part of it, but it seems silly because of the ignorance of the history of the Holy Roman Empire, and it seems to me like all of that area for most of history was broken up into a lot of different areas
That's right.
kind of came together and fell apart at different times.
That
and
was
came together
medieval.
and
That
fell
was
apart
medieval.
at different times.
In the medieval, the loyalty went to the king or the emperor.
Right.
And the count had his loyalty to the duke. It
So-
was decentralized.
Yeah, exactly. And the various principalities and everything. So I don't know. Obviously, it seems silly on the bald-faced racist
And chauvinistic nationalism.
part to begin with, but also just the history of that region.
Yeah. Hitler was
How
not
could you possibly unite all those
Hitler
people
was not
under
a good historian.
full,
He
fervent,
wanted to be an artist.
nationalistic
and he picked up his
It was
history
the
by reading newspapers.
trouncing in World War I, I suppose.
And the
took advantage of
newspapers
those
he
feelings.
read were written in socialist Darwinian language, social Darwinism. 1848, 1853.
Yeah, that was popular for a while.
Very popular. Darwin said that there is a struggle for...
I'd argue that it's still popular in a way.
Oh, yeah. I don't think Cruz has given it up.
Right?
The further you get
Or
down
the
to...
Republican Party in
Yeah, the
general.
further
it
you
seems
go
there's
south of the
a
Mason-Dixon
certain amount
line.
of contempt that they hold for anybody
The
who's
further
not
you
able to
get
lift
down to
themselves up out of
Alabama,
bootstraps.
Mississippi, Louisiana, you get into social Darwinist territory.
Right.
But Martin Luther King repudiated social Darwinism because of the excesses of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler exposed racism to the American middle class, the American elite. Because when they put the Nazis on trial, the Nazis had a very good excuse. You don't like what we do to Jews. Well, what are you doing in the South, buddy? Mm-hmm. That was an embarrassing question. Yeah, so racism is part of fascism. Nationalism is part of fascism. These are the various characteristics.
Station break?
Station break. Well, we're trying to define fascism in an objective way, and I've labeled 4 characteristics, and I'm debating this controversial subject with Dave DeWitt, who has his own ideas of fascism, and he's already outlined the 5th characteristic, corporatism. Mussolini invented corporatism. All the private banks and corporations should become state-controlled, and he even called it the law of corporations. This is a planned economy, and this was autarky, self-sufficiently. And the Italian state can become self-sufficient. It was a lot of hogwash because they had to borrow money, but they paid no attention to that. And they
never let facts get in the way of good propaganda.
Well, they knew Mussolini knew he was in debt to the British and French, and the Germans knew they had trouble with oil. But the Germans were going to have a IG Farben, a synthetic chemical company that could synthesize oil from coal and synthesize rubber from coal and be self-sufficient from the import from the United States and the British Empire, because Germany and Italy and Spain and Japan were all dependent on the oil oligopoly controlled in London and New York, because they controlled an oligopoly, the tankers, the refineries, the oil fields. And where would Germany get its oil? Well, there was 10% in the Soviet Union. And that was one of the things that led Hitler to invade Stalingrad and take over the Russia and get his own oil. Well, it failed in the ultimate end. But anyway.
Well, yeah. You open,
the characteristic is corporatism, self-sufficiently, and the nation state can control the rest of the world through its imperial army. Well, now the 5th characteristic is laissez-faire capitalism. The fascists were always clearer of what they were against rather than they were for. The Nazis and the Italians resented what happened to Germany and Italy in the First World War. And they never believed in laissez-faire. They believed in social welfare for the working class. They paid Social Security. They paid for health care. They inherited that from Bismarck. So the fascists were way ahead of the free enterprise, liberal American capitalists. And the British in 1911 began to catch up with German welfare legislation. And the New Deal did that in the 30s. But we got Social Security and workmen's compensation a little late, and we're still trying to get national health care. The United States is lagging behind Europe.
Every other developed nation
and every
on the
other
planet.
nation. That's the problem. So anyway, one of the characteristics of fascism is they didn't have anything against welfare legislation for the poor, but you don't have the right to strike. You're going to your labor union was going to be controlled by the state exactly the way the corporations were.
Everything is controlled by the state.
Right.
Everything is subordinated to the
So they had paid vacations to go to Italy. So the German working class could get a cheap vacation, but only in Italy. You couldn't spend your money in the United States and in Britain, which was on the gold standard, and drain Germany of its gold. So the fascists and the Nazis were collaborating, and that was one of the reasons for the alliance, the Axis alliance, in 1936, and eventually led to Mussolini supporting Hitler in the Greater World War II. Okay, 6 characteristics. Any questions or comment on that?
No, I think that's an astute analysis. I think that the main thrust to me is the authoritarianism and the subordination of everything, individual rights, property rights, everything to the state, to the one authority, in this case, the
Well,
dictator,
I have the 7th
the
characteristic, which to me is the most important. And that is what I call a Manichaean conspiratorial ideology. As I say, the fascists were clear what they were against. Anti-Semite, anti-Christian, anti-plutocratic, but they didn't say what they were for, okay? And this comes from a Persian philosophy. Mani was a Persian philosopher who divided the world between black and white. And Manichaeanism has influenced the Christian scripture, the Jewish scripture, and certainly all of the Islamic scriptures. You're either for me or against you. There's no technicolor. There's no 7 colors of the rainbow. Well, the book of Revelation is one of the most dangerous books in the Bible, written by John of Patmos in 90 A.D. And
while in exile.
He invented the term Antichrist. He was not for God. He was against sin. He was more interested in the devil than God. That's the problem with Manichaeanism. The great Satan. And of course, when the Ayatollah Khomeini, he came out. The United States is the great Satan. The devil theory of history.
Well, it's useful, is it not?
It's useful in wartime.
Whenever you have
a war, you can always
it's useful to be able to designate something or someone the great Satan.
Right. Well, in World War I, the United States denounced the Germans as Huns. Now, Rosa was a little bit cautious. He never denounced the German people. He denounced Nazism. He was a bit of a Manichaean, but he was not a total Manichaean. He was anti-fascist, anti-Nazi, and anti-Japanese empire. But he made a slip in California when racism in California led to the internment of Japanese citizen or American citizen of Japanese descent. And they arrested him and sent them to Utah, which was one of Roosevelt's great weaknesses.
Yeah, and Eleanor never tired of harassing him about that, by the way.
Yeah.
I like to think of them in combination because Franklin was he was willing to try almost anything and see what worked.
Well, he was a politician.
Eleanor was the conscience.
She was the idealist, right. That is true. That is very true.
Didn't she insist that a Japanese family stay with them in the White House?
I'm not sure
when he began
about
the internment?
I didn't hear that story.
That's the story that I heard.
Story
but I don't know if it actually came to fruition.
The famous story is Marian Anderson. The DAR, the Daughters of American Revolution, forbade a black to sing in Washington, D.C. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt, through her power, invited Mary Anderson to sing in 1937.
Yeah.
And this is the beginning of the breakdown of racism. The Scottsboro case was another breakdown. Now, Roosevelt was buttering up the Southern Democrats in order to get votes, and he wasn't going to take a lead in taking care of racism. But in 1941, we had the Black Porters Union, and they put in price control, in which all prices and wages would be frozen. And this is where Randolph comes to the White House and says, I will sign this pledge if you open up the defense plants to black unemployed on an equal basis. And that's the beginning of desegregation of the war industries in World War II. Yeah. A. Philip Randolph And he says, well, if you don't, we have the porters, we're going to go on strike. Well, Roosevelt wanted to avoid the strike. He
Right.
told the South, well, you got to get going with the war. So eventually, the war against Hitler leads to American consciousness. We got to do something about racism in the United States, and that led to Branch Rickey, the Brooklyn Dodgers, the integration, and Martin Luther King, and fascism was on the defensive in the United States up to Lyndon Johnson. Well, Lyndon Johnson is on the borderline. He did a lot for the blacks, but he got involved with the war, and then Nixon was Southern strategy. He was going to bring back the old South, and we have that problem now. Well, I guess I've said enough about fascism, unless you have any other comments, objections about this problem the United States is facing today in the Democratic Convention and the Republican Convention. And the question is, how far will Trump go with his crazy propaganda?
Oh, I don't think there is a limit.
Well, he's got to get votes.
Right. Yeah, he'll say anything. And what's difficult to figure out with him, obviously, is what is his program. He'll say anything.
He has no program as of now.
Right. So it's very scattershot. It seems as though he changes his mind as he's driving from one event
He's
to
a
the other.
demagogue. We both agree he's a demagogue. He could become a fascist in certain tendencies if he got elected.
Well,
He
he's
has to get
definitely
elected.
got authoritarian impulses.
He's got to get elected
He
first.
doesn't have any comprehension of the balance of powers.
None.
Or, the powers of the executive under the Constitution.
Well, it's most likely he'll lose.
Yeah.
The polls say he loses.
Right. But
So
we
I
all
guess
must suffer until then.
All right, we'll go to a new question. What do you think of Bill Clinton's speech at the Philadelphia Convention? How did he endorse his wife?
Well, he made it personal, which I think was the right strategy from a PR standpoint, to talk about his personal history with Hillary and emphasize that. But it also made the omissions a little glaring when
Yes,
they came to
that's
them.
right.
If you're going to talk about all that personal history and then leave out the most notorious episode in their marriage.
Right. It was A+ as propaganda. No question about that. But he clearly avoided talking about his many sexual affairs.
Right.
Monica Lewinsky was never mentioned.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people noticed.
Well, certainly the Republicans noticed.
Yeah. I think that he's still a powerful orator, but to not address that at all, even Democrats I know were
Well, the Sanders people were critical.
scratching their heads over that.
Well, yeah. Anyway,
to not even acknowledge it.
Anyway, the way Bill portrayed this problem is that he had to ask Hillary 3 times to get married. And he was an unsophisticated boy from Arkansas, and they met in law school at Yale. And she came from a more sophisticated background in Illinois and went to Wellesley College. And he stares at this beautiful girl at the end of the library, according to his story. And Hillary comes up and said, well, if you're going to ask me for a date, ask me. So he did.
Yes. It's a good anecdote.
And then he says he had a couple of dates, and then he said, will you marry me? And she said, no, I have to do welfare work.
Yeah.
I go to Massachusetts, and I got to go to states and take care of black children and white children who need social service. I'm not a politician. So anyway,
As charming as those personal anecdotes might have been, I
you think it was all hot air.
well, you know my favorite joke about Bill Clinton.
What is it?
Bill Clinton came to the fork in the road, so he took it.
Then what? What's the joke?
That's it. That's the joke. You can't take a fork in the road. But I think that the...
You mean he went through the middle of the fork?
Well,
He didn't go right
I
and
mean
left,
that
he
he
went right
always
up into the
wants
hill.
to have it both ways. But the thing that I thought that was better about his speech, the point that he made that I thought was more significant, was his emphasis on her getting practical results for making people's lives better.
He said she was for social service
emphasize
first.
that.
She was for social service. That's the good Hillary, and she only became a politician later. That was his justification.
Well, that's true. She's still trying to become a politician. She's not exactly natural.
Yeah, right, right.
In her enthusiasms on the
Anyway, the third time he asks her, he says, I built a house here in Arkansas. This is a dream house. You like that house. Will you marry me to get the house? So she finally gives in. That's his story.
Right.
She didn't deny the story. She just avoided it. But it was an interesting performance on television in Philadelphia to unite the Democratic Party. But all politicians lie, and all politicians do propaganda. And you might say Bill is a good propagandist. That's my conclusion. But my wife and I, as far as that is concerned, our argument, okay, he committed adultery, but it's too late. It's not an impeachable defense. The Republicans are wrong in trying this impeachment.
Oh, in the 90s? Yeah.
If Hillary, if Bill is guilty of all of these sins, why
the Republicans chasing Bill Clinton's genitals all around the Beltway was an absurd episode in American history. Right. Especially considering the rampant adultery that takes place. And what's happened to some of his most prominent critics, Dennis Hastert, case in point.
Right. And Trump himself, three-time loser.
Right. But that only matters when the right says that it matters.
Yeah, well, the Republicans have their propaganda machine. The Democrats have theirs. And anyway, so we excuse the Clintons by saying, well, it's too late. If it was an impeachable offense, Hillary should have sued this in a court. But she stuck by her husband.
Well, their relationship was always power-based to begin with.
A lot of.
I don't think it was one of the great romances of history.
Well, who knows what they really think? That no one knows. But she was a politician, and she did take care of the books and got enough money for Bill to get elected as Attorney General in Arkansas, and Bill to get elected in as governor. And Bill had a joke about that. After he was elected as governor, he quotes some hillbilly. He said, it looks like we elected the wrong Clinton. That was a good joke. Bill was good at the jokes. Anyway, it was a good speech from the point of view of public relations and Philadelphia unification of the Democrats using for all it's worth. Now, there was a critic of Bill's speech, and it's worthy to quote him. His name was Patrick Healy of the New York Times. And he uses Bill Clinton's speech as a critic for the feminists. He said Bill referred to his wife as an object of desire. And some of these feminists said that he are uneasy in Bill referring to Hillary as a girl. That's the sexual arguments that are going on behind the scenes.
Now, I'm not married, but I'm pretty sure it's fairly standard for someone's wife to be an object of desire, as well as many other things. But is that not part of marriage? As for the girl, that's just a colloquial line.
Well,
that's part of the down-home charm that
I have no answer except
I met a girl.
I have no answer except
when I was
that
22,
every marriage is unique, and they have to make the two couples, the one couple, man and female, have to make a contract of what we agree and what we will tolerate, and how you can be different. So anyway, Lois supported Hillary in the primary. I supported Bernie Sanders. Now we're united again on the same page. but usually we vote for the same party platform. And we agreed of Bill and Hillary's sexual indiscretions. It was too late for impeachment. That's a political answer to a personal problem. So I have no other criticisms of this, and I think that Patrick Healy had the right to criticize Bill, and they did allow that. Well, this is the New York Times criticism of Bill Clinton's speech. We have to give the other side some. Anyway,
it's fine.
I agree with Bill Clinton on this whole sexual question. The right answer is don't ask and don't tell. That goes for male and female. And I learned that as a kid.
A little discretion?
What do you mean, a little discretion?
You just think people should keep everything to themselves, is what you're saying.
I'm saying that when I was a kid, I went to Bates College.
I don't believe that it's a political. I think that there was something better about the time, such as like during the 40s when there were a handful of editors who knew everything that was going on in Washington, and they decided this isn't news, that we don't report these things.
I have no comment on what journalists should do. They can report or not report depending upon what the newspaper wants to do. That's freedom of press.
Right.
I'm not criticizing.
I'm not talking about state limitation of press. I'm talking about editorial discretion.
Okay.
In the newsrooms.
All right.
themselves.
So you want to clarify that? What is editorial discretion?
I think that as an editor of a publication, you have to recognize that you have a lot of power about what gets into the public conversation, and the whole TMZ paparazzi thing of trying to go out and do gotcha journalism on everything is not the most ethical or noble way to exercise that power.
When I was a boy in 1948, we had two classes of newspapers, the New York Times and the New York Herald Tribune and the Wall Street Journal were elite press their slogan in the New York Times was, "We print all the news fit to print." Now the Daily News
It is.
and the
It gives me a laugh every time I read it.
the Hearst paper believed in what was called yellow journalism.
Oh, I know all about.
And that was
Really?
a low-class press. And the British press is even worse. They got the London Guardian, the elite liberal press, and then they have a little sheet published by Murdoch, which has half-naked girls on the cover, like Playboy, in a daily newspaper. Okay. So anyway, what I'm saying is, when Bill Clinton was president, and all of this sexuality story came out, Bill Clinton had a slogan, "Don't ask and don't tell." And I'm saying that in my own personal experience, when I was 20 at Bates College, the boys were very cautious about squealing on another girl. The girls all wanted to preserve their virginity. So if they did have an affair, and they would protect all of the Bates co-eds. And they did the same thing at Oberlin and Wellesley and all of the other liberal arts colleges. And squealing
That sounds
out
like don't kiss and tell to me.
What are you talking about?
Don't kiss and tell. It's the same thing. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, when I was 20, I went to University of Pennsylvania. And I went to dental school. And I had roommates who were much older than I was. I was 20. They were 23, 24. They had already had sex intercourse when they were in the American Army and the American Navy. And they thought I was a little bit naive, still being a virgin at age 20, okay? Well, I listened to their story. And so, but I learned about sex by going to older men, okay? and saying, well, what is your experience? Okay. Well, anyway, I transferred from the University of Pennsylvania to the University of Delaware in order to get my BA. Again, I met older students. I was 22 at University of Delaware. And who should I meet? A 32-year-old German who had been in the German Navy but had come to the University of Delaware to study agriculture. And there were 4 German students on that campus. They were the first Germans allowed on an American campus since the end of the Second World War. They were afraid of Nazis, okay? So they were restricted. You can only study agriculture. You can't get into political science and history or any thing. So anyway, I took this guy, Bob Cobb was his name, to Florida in order to show him Florida, and we hitchhiked there. And then I stayed with my relatives in Orlando, and then he hitchhiked alone from Orlando down to Key West. So this is where the sex story comes. He got picked up by a woman. He said, I got picked up by a woman. So I'm being the naive kid and say, well, did you have sex intercourse? And what did he say? He said, none of your business. I took that to heart, and I believe, don't ask, don't tell. End of story.
Very good. And fascism.
Okay.
So
we'll have to continue. We haven't finished the Democratic Convention.
No, we haven't. We somehow got a little off on that, but we'll. I think that we covered fascism sufficiently.
Right.
And
Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton and Hillary's relationship.
Yeah.
And discretion.
Discretion. Okay.
Thank you for having me, Professor.
Thank you for coming.
Always good to see you.